Right, I think we're all here, so I'm going to start. My name's Ross Bradshaw from Five Leaves Bookshop. The other person from Five Leaves tonight is Simon Griffiths, who's handling the tech. I'm your host for this evening, representing the Alliance of Radical Booksellers. I'm very pleased to welcome panel and audience to the 10th Bread and Roses Award for Radical Bookselling. This will either be live, and we don't know who the winner is. The judges do, or it's recorded, or you'll be hearing it on YouTube, and you may well know who the winner is, because you'll hopefully see it in the book trade press or whatever. People will be watching it now and watching it later. So I should say something about the Alliance of Radical Booksellers. The Alliance has been going for about 12, 13 years, and it comprises all sorts of different radical bookshops, ranging from one-person bookshops to full-service professional bookshops. It includes shops that have been going for 60-odd years, and like Houseman's. It includes bookshops that have been going for 1 year, like Shelf Life in Cardiff, which is just moving to new premises. Good luck with that. There's 7 new members of the Alliance joined in the last year. And that's really quite exciting for us, because 7 for such a relatively small group is quite a lot. The particular area of growth is in LGBT plus groups, shops that are opened, which are spreading around the country. Gaze the Word has always been a member of the Alliance, but now there's a number of LGBT plus groups that have joined, which is really exciting. We have 2 awards. We have one big project, the London Radical Book Fair, which hasn't happened the last 2 years because of COVID. We hope it will be there next year at Goldsmiths in South London. There are radical book fairs around the country, but the ARB organises the London event. We have 2 prizes. We have the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing, this one. And after a few years, it became obvious that it was a bit awkward that children's books couldn't enter. So having discussed that, we set up the Little Rebels Award, which in the way that children have of outgrowing their parents and carers, the Little Rebels Award is now bigger than the Bread and Roses Award. It's run by Letterbox Library and Houseman's and various other groups, and it's semi-independent, but that's a good thing. So this is our 10th year. The first winner was David Graeber with his book on debt, the late David Graeber. The last winner was Johnny Pitts with his book Afropean. And if you look at the shortlists over the last 10 years and you look at the winners over the last 10 years, that's a fair summation of what people were buying in the radical book world. At the moment, we only do non-fiction. We didn't feel that we were able to do fiction. And of course, as well as radical non-fiction, there's any amount of radical fiction out there. So format tonight is that I'm going to be handing over to Jane Watts. There were 4 judges of the award: Jane Watts, Tom Winter-Rayner, Karen Shooks, and Jane Elliott. Jane was involved in the shortlisting, and then stood aside while the other 3 were involved in choosing the winner. Jane's going to talk about the books in turn. So I think I'm not going to say what they are. You saw the screen at the start of the event. Jane will introduce them briefly, and she'll talk about the shortlisting, the long listing, the shortlisting. She'll say something about each book, and then we'll ask all of the authors, or in one case, the publisher on behalf of the author, to do the ARB equivalent of speed dating by talking about their book for 4 minutes, and then Karen Shooks will come in to tell us who won and say a few more words about that. So I'll hand over to Jane Watts on behalf of the judges.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, and a big welcome, particularly to our shortlisted authors. And thanks so much for your books. We've enjoyed them. Now, I'm going to, in this first little piece, just say a little bit about the context about this year's prize. And then I'm going to say a little bit about the long list and the process of reading. And then once you authors and representative authors have all introduced your books, I'll say a little bit more about each book from the judge's point of view before I hand over to Karen to announce the winner. So because I want to leave it with the authors to do the most about their book rather than me saying what we thought, which is, on one level, only a little bit of relevance. But with, this context, I think the first thing that took us by surprise was the number of submissions. We'd been hearing all year about how publishers were delaying publications. And two of us, Tom and I, have been judges on this before. And we thought, oh, phew, there won't be so many books coming, haha. So enrolled over 50 books. And thank you for that. That's great, because it just shows what richness there is in radical publishing. But just one brief thing about the shortlist. What we're really pleased about this year is that the majority of the books on the shortlist come from radical presses. That it hasn't always been the case. And it was really good to see that. It felt like a real depth, a real strength in our world here. So there we were, 50 to 60 books, a very wide range of topics. And quite, well, just the odd few that don't quite fit the brief. And you think, oh, what were they thinking of? But anyway, the rest of it is what a joy. Not quite unadulterated when one comes in with about 600 pages and you think, oh, right, okay, can I really do that justice? But we then, as readers, had the opportunity to find out about the number of topics. Well, the history of tennis, to a handbook on basic income, a graphic book, and as well as a whole load of in-depth academic books on very particular historical moments, and new thinking on anything you'd care to mention, but particularly I'll just mention economics because there were quite a few this year. What a rich set of reading, and quite time-taking in some cases. So some of those books, I would say, brought really new insights, often to age-old dilemmas, but we're representing them for new audiences. And other people, other authors, were bringing in entirely new topics that were certainly new to even those of us who read an enormous amount, far more than is probably good for us. So therefore, we were left with a daunting task of picking a shortlist. We got a sort of medium long list to begin with, and then went to shortlist. What the great thing is about reading for this, and I don't know what it's like, but you hear rumours about other prizes that they fall out with each other and things. We've never fallen out with each other on this while I've been involved. I believe that might have happened in the past. I'm saying nothing. And we actually arrive at a shortlist very amicably and with a lot of very, very good discussion. And it's actually a very interesting process to be part of, and a real privilege, actually. So I'd like to thank you all for your books. What a privilege we had to read them hot off the press. And we're going to hand over to the authors, and Ross is going to introduce you in turn to just tell us a little bit about your books, or to read from them. Okay, Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. I'll just very briefly mention who the authors are, and a one-sentence biography. There is no time really to give a full introduction to the authors. They're going to appear in alphabetical order. So first we have Ellen Clifford, who's going to be talking about the war on disabled people, capitalism, welfare, and the making of human catastrophe. Ellen's involved in Disabled People Against the Cuts, and she's published by Zed. In the introduction, Jane said a number of the publishers were from the radical side, more this year from the radical side. She's published by Zed, which are now part of Bloomsbury. So it's a radical list within a major independent. And if you read the Book Trade Press or the Dutch financial columns, you'll see that Bloomsbury is hugely, hugely profitable. I hope that they can use some of that money to promote Ellen's book more than they already have, because there's a danger, of course, when a list becomes part of a conglomerate, that things get lost. I'm sure ZAD workers and the authors will fight for the book. So please, Ellen, you have 4 minutes to talk about your book.
Thanks, Ross. And yeah, I was taken on by Z before they were taken over by Bloomsbury, and wasn't always the easiest process, but the team who I'm working with now have been very supportive. And the War on Disabled People basically came about because a commissioning editor at Z called Ken Barlow discovered a disability-shaped hole in Z's catalogue, and he set out to try and fill that. So he asked around, and apparently my name came up, and he approached me, and I jumped at the chance because I felt there was an urgent need for a book. And the War on Disabled People was essentially based on 3 key needs that I felt I wanted to address. So the first was to record a pivotal moment in disabled people's history from the perspective of disabled people ourselves. And too often in the past, we've been cut out of our own history in line with dominant ideas in society of disabled people as passive victims who lack agency. And people may disagree with what we do with that agency, but please debate our politics and don't ignore our existence or our impact. And I knew firsthand as an activist the determination and resourcefulness that had gone in from grassroots activists to resisting every cut that the government had in for us since 2010, which is essentially what the book is about, that period from 2010 onwards and the impact of policies and legislation on disabled people. The unprecedented investigation of the UK by the United Nations Disability Committee that the book refers to, it didn't come out of thin air. It was the product of years of hard work by the Disabled People Against Cuts research team, Debbie, Linda, who I see is watching, Annie and Bob. And that seemed to me to be too important a fact to let get cut out of history. And as I argue in the book, I think it's actively dangerous when disabled people have illusions that change comes from above, that it's only a case of finding a hero or champion and suddenly all will be well. Real change only happens from below. Yet disabled people face such great barriers to mobilising resistance, greater barriers than other groups in society. And that situation has grown acutely worse since 2010, with many more activists now trapped in their own homes without enough social care support to even click on a petition, let alone go out to join a protest. And so that was the second need that I wanted the book to fulfil. To explain to disabled people why we can never become complacent, as I believe that the disabled people's rights movement did under the new Labour years. Why so long as we live under a system that puts profit before people, disabled people will need to continuously struggle in times of economic prosperity for dignity and equality, but in times of economic recession and depression for even the right to live and the very means of survival. I thought it was crucial to explain my view on how the attacks on disabled people in 2010 belong to a wider context, that it's too simple to blame the callousness of the Tories in power, that we need to understand the intrinsic and dynamic relationship that exists between capitalism and disability. My third aim was to make some small dent in increasing interest and understanding of disability politics among the wider left. The pervasive lack of interest is a constant gripe of disabled people that in my research I found went back decades, and it does exist across the political spectrum. And as frustrating as it is the direct product of the othering of disabled people so successfully achieved by the dominant ideas about disability that are prevalent in society that serve to exclude and marginalise us. I think it's important that disabled people understand where those attitudinal barriers we experience come from. To finish with, I'm going to be honest and say I found the process of writing the book hellish. I loved the research, I loved the writing, but there are other factors directly linked to the challenges I face as a person who lives with severe and enduring mental distress that made my first book quite a tough process. There was a direct conflict between the intrinsic lack of self-worth that lack of self-worth I experienced with my mental health condition, and the idea of having my name on a book that was fairly big that I had to try and overcome. But the importance, well, alongside the love and support from my family and friends and my campaigning community, it was the importance of paying tribute to the achievements of fellow disabled activists, past and present, that got me through. And so it was to them that I dedicated the book. The acknowledgements in the War on Disabled People mentions the name of key activists that we lost since 2010. Premature death being like quite a tragic phenomenon of disability activism. So to end this evening, if it's okay, I just want to read the names of a few of those that we've lost since the book was published, that have particularly touched me, although I know there will be many others who I didn't know who've also gone. But key activists we've lost: Sean McGovern, Manjeet Kaur, Sian Vasey, Daphne Blanchflower, Bill Albert, Paul Tailforth, and Red Ted Knight. Rest in power. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. It's a reminder that it's never just the book, is it? There's more than the book. It's an open invitation to come up to Nottingham. We've done a number of events on disability, autism particularly, and other forms of disability, sometimes working with disability rights groups. And it's an open invitation to next spring come up and join one of our events. Hopefully by then we'll be doing live events. The second person to speak tonight is Stella Dadzie, with A Kick in the Belly, Women, Slavery and Resistance, which is published by Verso. And those of you who've been around long enough may well remember one of the previous book called Heart of the Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain, which came out astonishingly in 1985 and is still an influential book. But Stella tonight is going to be talking about her new book, of course, A Kick in the Belly.
Thank you. Thank you, and hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here, albeit just in a virtual sense. And I do want to thank my publisher, Verso, both for republishing The Heart of the Race, the book you referred to, Ross, and also publishing A Kick in the Belly, which seems to have come out at a timely moment in the context of Black Lives Matter and all the other events that have occurred in the last couple of years. A Kick in the Belly is about enslaved women and how they fought back. It begins on the continent of Africa and continues on through the Coffle Line into the barracoons and slave pens, onto the decks of slave ships and onto the plantations of the British West Indian islands. And it shows how at every step of that journey, Black women found ways to subvert and resist the endeavours of their enslavers to rob them of their humanity. It's a story of gendered barbarity, but it's also a story of gendered resistance, told through the voices of those who were around to tell the tale at the time and record it: the colonists, the diarists, the letter writers and record keepers who had a stake in the institution and developed their own perverse rationale for the inhuman practices that they needed to sustain enslavement. But the voices of Black women, I hope, ring loudly and clearly through. Voices of women like Mary Prince, whose narrative provides a really intriguing insight into the lived realities of enslaved African people. I can think of no better way to summarize the book and to introduce it to this audience than to read a small extract from the introduction, which is what I'm going to do. And I hope, if nothing else, this will whet your appetite and encourage you to go out and read the book itself. History has a convenient and highly selective memory. This much we know. But if we sift through the evidence, a far more complex picture begins to emerge. The canvas may be worn, the paint may be cracked and faded, but there are women in the foreground and they do not look happy. Look closer and you'll see them more clearly. Their bodies are bent, their feet calloused and swollen. They are menstruating, giving birth, collapsing from fatigue, and dying from abuse and hideous diseases. Across their backs, thick keloid scars are clearly visible, as are the suppurating wounds left by brandings, collars, and leg irons. The few who are clothed sport sweat stains under their armpits. Some look half crazed with the horror of it all. Some seem resigned to the prospect of an untimely death. But others are watching and waiting, biding their time, plotting their escape or dreaming of revenge. Occasionally, the glint of a weapon or a barely concealed vial of poison hints at a more ominous practice. Against this backdrop of unrelenting misery, some women have found ways to make their lives more bearable. At first glance, they do not look like women who would willingly trade their bodies for trinkets or treats. Without doubt, there are some favoured concubines amongst them, women who have learnt to play the few cards they were dealt by opting to collude or comply. They stand haughty and erect, ever mindful of their perilous status. Yet those who seek favour, rather than endure the miserable fate of their mothers and grandmothers, are in a distinct minority. The numbers speak for themselves. They are the exception to the rule. Move closer, and our picture becomes even more intriguing. Away from the fields, some women can be seen dusting the silver or waiting at table with lowered eyes and pricked ears. Others are busy hauling produce to the market or hiring out their skills as cooks, seamstresses, laundresses, nurses, and midwives. Their mobility is a godsend, particularly for those with clandestine messages to convey or overheard news. A handful of female entrepreneurs, having acquired or purchased their freedom, have opened lodging houses, supplementing their precarious income by administering to the sick or tending to the needs of passing travellers. With their keen, well-tuned ears, they too have a role to play in this vast subversive grapevine. The majority of the women are toiling in the fields and mill houses. Many have an angry glint in their eyes as they feed the huge rollers or squint skywards at the merciless sun. Beyond them, in the distant mountains and forests, hard to detect in the dense foliage, we may even catch a glimpse of the occasional female maroon, proud, ferocious women, so intent on a self-determined life that they prefer the risk of a brutal death to the prospect of recapture. With this more nuanced image of female resistance in mind, it cannot be right that their historical legacy is so one-dimensional. As the planter monk Lewis observed, Black women were kicked in the belly from one end of the period of slavery to the other. Yet in many ways, these women's response can be seen as a metaphorical kick in the belly for those who tried and failed to dehumanize them. To deny them their rightful place in history simply adds insult to a 400-year-long injury.
Right, thank you, Stella. Appreciate the particular phrase, gendered barbarity and gendered resistance, which we might just put up above your book in the shop tomorrow. Next speaker is Marcus Gilroy. Marcus will be talking about After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News, published by Repeater, one of two authors from Repeater on tonight. Marcus has got a new book coming soon called Black British Lives Matter, which is an anthology of writing by a number of Black writers. And also I discovered from his website that his grandmother was Beryl Gilroy, who wrote the book Black Teacher, which was really very influential book, and it's really good to see it back on the bookshelves again. Unfortunately, he only has 4 minutes, because otherwise I'd be tempted to say, can we talk about your grandmother as well? So Marcus has only got 4 minutes, and he's going to have to talk about, after the fact, the truth about fake news, not his family.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for, I don't know, it's very great to be here. I realize we don't have much time, so I'm not going to say very much. I selected a reading from the book, which is probably slightly better than trying to summarize the book verbally. I don't think I'm able to do that. I've been criticized for trying to talk about too many things in this book already. So yeah, I'm just going to read something from it. I have timed this reading. It comes in approximately 4 minutes, so I hope that's all right. I won't say any more. I'm just going to go in and read it. Just before Christmas 2018, I visited a branch of an upmarket cosmetics chain, somewhere I never normally dare visit, to purchase a somewhat over-the-top stocking filler for a loved one. The product I was looking for was not in stock, but a representative from the skincare brand whose product I was trying to buy was in the shop and began to attempt to sell me something else instead. Catching me off guard, her first question, in order to narrow down the selection of the various creams that were in stock, was, "How old is she?" I replied that the recipient was mid-30s, and like clockwork, the sales assistant ventured something to the effect of, "Perhaps you should try this one. It's got anti-aging properties." "She doesn't need that," I said with a smile, refusing the assumptions in the question. But the meaning of my refusal was lost and interpreted as an insistence that the intended recipient didn't need that product because she looked so good without it. While it was true that the recipient looked young for her age, this was not what I meant. "Well, she is mid-30s, so she'll be starting to age," the assistant responded earnestly in a slight German accent. Annoyed, but unable to articulate my frustration, I said after an uneasy pause, "I think I'll just buy the one I'm looking for online," and thanked the assistant for her help with a forced smile before walking away. What I should have said at this point was, "No, I mean, she doesn't need that because you're selling at least 3 complete lies here. First of all, that aging is avoidable. Secondly, that it is your moisturizer of all things that will arrest the aging process. And thirdly, that aging is even bad and that her value as a person will in some way be reduced by a natural aging process once it becomes discernible, which is the most malicious lie of all." Of course, in a broader sense, the cosmetics companies are winning at the moment. Whatever clever response I may have been able to muster would not have changed the fact that as long as the idea of aging is bad, is commonplace enough in the cultural landscape, people will continue to buy products that promise to address the problem they believe it to be. And this type of culturally driven disinformation is extremely powerful. Relaying this somewhat frustrating but instructive encounter to my sister later that day, I was scolded that I should have known better about what to expect before entering into that shop, the mecca of such lies. Consider me told. But my sister is absolutely right. Venturing into the depths of the consumer society, I should have been expecting deceit from every direction. As the founder of another cosmetics corporation, Revlon, Charles Revson, once reportedly said, "In our factory, we make cosmetics. In the store, we sell hope." Against the backdrop of fake news, we tend to talk about misinformation and disinformation as a very specific type of problem that certain people are responsible for. Online extremists, big tech, the Russians, or unreliable social media users who are apparently stuck in echo chambers. At the very least, any threats posed by these villains turn out to be more nuanced, but there is also the case to be made that this is an incredibly selective, exaggerated, and at times disingenuous understanding of misinformation and disinformation that has arisen in response to the highly specific historical conditions that have characterized the last few decades. If we're going to talk about misinformation and disinformation, there needs to be an honest engagement with the ways that power and the shiny, appealing, market-driven forms it has assumed in the 20th and early 21st centuries wormed its way into our lives, invited us to participate, and guided what we know, believe, and accept about the world we inhabit. Perhaps having our democracy taken away in the Euro-Atlantic world in the last few years was actually quite fun for a while. As Alfie Bone has observed, we are, after all, being constantly encouraged to enjoy ourselves. Perhaps this is why my predictable encounter with the gleaming, LED-lit mendacity of luxury cosmetics, even if it may seem a bit silly, is as good a place as any to begin examining the ways that much more widespread patterns of misinformation and disinformation, such as hyperbole, propaganda, spin, illiteracy, and myth, enabled the hollowing out of our democracy. It at least provides us with the tip of an important iceberg. The market-driven society is invariably a bullshit society. So that's my selected reading. That's from the beginning of the second chapter of the book, which is in a way the first chapter of the book, because the real first chapter is in fact a sort of historical introduction to the conditions that the book is talking about. But I won't take up any more time. Thank you all. And I'll hand on to the next person.
Thanks, Marcus. You probably didn't manage to see on the chat at the same time as you were speaking, somebody saying thank you, Marcus, from somebody who used to work for Revlon. So that was quite.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Maybe more than one person here was worked for Revlon, but one person at least was. Next we have Emma Griffin, author of Breadwinner, An Intimate History of the Victorian Economy, published by Yale. Emma's has written a number of books on English social history, including on the Industrial Revolution and on blood sports. So I'm about to say, please welcome Emma. Yes, please welcome Emma Griffin.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Thank you, everybody, as well. I'm really delighted, obviously, to be here, and it's just lovely to be in such company and to talk about my book. So I am a historian. I've always worked on working class people. I discovered working class autobiographies way back in the 1990s when I was working on sports and pastimes, kind of working class sports and pastimes. And I love these sources. These are sources where working people start to tell their own stories in their own words. And I knew I wanted to work with them one day. And I did. That project came to a close in about 2013. It was published as a book called Liberty's Dawn. And it was really about the experience of living through the Industrial Revolution. That's the period that I've got expertise in. What was it like to live during the Industrial Revolution if you were actually a working person yourself? And these working class autobiographies told this story in their own word. They're wonderful sources to work with. They were all written by men. There's not very much you can do about that. You can't go back and get new sources that were written by women. So it was a book that relied very heavily on male voices and male experiences, which I was very happy with at the time, because I still felt it was very important to put working class voices into our understanding of the Industrial Revolution. The project finished, and I loved working with these sources, and I knew I wanted to carry on working with these sources. And the wonderful thing as you move into the Victorian period is you start to get lots of working class autobiographies that are written by women as well. Really, the story that is being told changes, the form and the kind of the style of working class autobiography changes a lot when women start writing. So it seemed very natural to carry on the story into the Victorian period. And I think now, which I didn't really see at the time, but more recently, I've come to realize that I also had changed quite a lot over this period. So I'd started that first project as a young academic, making her way in the world. By the time I was starting this project, Breadwinner, that I'm talking about tonight, I'd had 2 children. My own experience had changed very radically. I'd tried to combine work and child rearing. It had been very difficult. And I think also becoming a mother, you realize this connection with generations, with millions of women from the dawn of time who've gone through this process of giving birth, and the kind of enormity of that experience, and feeling this connection, and also realizing as a historian, we don't know very much about it. And I think I just was never going to write history in quite the same way because of the changes that happened in my life. So I guess that's where I was coming from. I wanted to put women's stories back in. It meant moving forward chronologically, because that's when women started to write. And what happened when I did that? That's what this book is all about, really. Well, I think the simple message is things look really, really different when you look at women's stories and you sit them alongside men's stories as well. And I think the thing that came out with great clarity when you start to get women's voices in the narrative is that households need work. Households need lots and lots of work, especially in the pre-industrial era where water needs to be fetched, wood needs to be chopped. There's no refrigeration, so every meal is cooked from scratch over and over again every day. There is no convenience to living, just the labour of being alive. Just being alive requires a lot of labour. And of course, this has historically been women's work, and it's not been paid. and it's not very visible in any of our historical sources. So just in the few seconds I've got left, the other big takeaway that I had discovered when I put women's stories into the narrative is that prior to industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, there'd been a kind of balance. As long as society was very, very poor, there was a kind of balance in what men and women did. So men traditionally worked for the wages, but they didn't earn very much, and they could only get comfort and food and meals if they gave all that wage over to their wife, who then worked really hard to turn that tiny scrap of money into food, meals, comfort, clothes, all firewood, all the things that you need. And what happens with the Industrial Revolution, what happens in modern industrial societies as male wages get higher, is that balance between what men and women do starts to break down. So men can now get some degree of comfort and some degree of leisure and some degree of self-worth through guarding their money for themselves. And the value of what the woman has to offer within a household is kind of falls down the order. So I think that's 4 minutes. That's my time. That covers everything that I think I can say. I think if there's one takeaway, the one takeaway for me really with putting the women's stories into the narrative is just that history looks very, very different, and the things that women do. And I think it's a message for our own times as well, that households and being alive requires some kind of labour, that we don't pay that labour usually. And that makes it very hard for us as a society, which is very fixated on paid work and wages, to really get a measure of the meaning, the significance and the extent of that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was absolutely fascinating on the issue of the development of wages and how that impacted on power of gender. That was really new to me. Thank you. Owen Hatherley read Metropolis, Socialism and the Government of London, the second book published by Repeater. Owen, it's very hard to keep up with his writings. Landscape of Communism, Clean Living Under Difficult Circumstances, which have just started upstairs, and I have no favourites whatsoever in this dog race, but I share Owen's interest in Ian Nairn, which people can look up later should they not know. Owen, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you. So the book, which is here with this image of the London County Council crest, is a history of municipal socialism in London. But how I came to write a history of municipal socialism in London was quite convoluted, and I think that tells a few things about the book and what sort of book it is. So it sort of began as a commission from the New Left Review, who I think, partly in response to me writing a piece about Ken Livingstone and how this kind of one-time kind of paragon of the left ended up kind of producing such a kind of, sort of oligarchic, sort of neoliberal city in the era when he was mayor in the 2000s. And so I started on that, and then as sort of what was going to be a kind of, another kind of London doom thing, of which there's quite a lot, kind of London as sort of capital of awful inequality, and it's dreadful, and why do we live here, those of us that do. And then the 2019 general election happened, in which the movement that I was a very, very, very minor kind of participant in got smashed to pieces. And the thing that struck me after I'd sort of had time to think about what had happened was that the places where it hadn't got smashed to pieces were the large cities of England and Wales, and particularly in that Liverpool and London. Not being qualified to write about Liverpool, it ended up being about London, and I think with the way I kind of, the idea of sort of taking municipal socialism in London as a kind of response to that was very much a sense of like, well, we've sort of failed to seize and sort of governmental power, that whole project had obviously failed, but there had been numerous experiments in London in the 1890s, in the 1930s, and then in the 1980s, in kind of merging kind of popular power, social movements, the labour movement, and local government in London into a force which had changed people's lives very much for the better. And I was sort of motivated by the idea of like, would it be possible to try this again? And an emphasis, I think, on the various ways in which these sort of usually opposed forces had all kind of interacted with each other in a very, very productive way. So the subtitle is Socialism and the Government of London, and the denominations of socialists are quite various there. There's, socialism in terms of kind of the arts and crafts movement derived from William Morris. There's socialism in terms of a kind of sort of statist socialism. There's socialism as in the communists who were very active in the East End in the 20s and 30s. There's socialism as in socialist planning and modernist architecture. And then there's the kind of sort of post-1968 socialism of the 1980s New Left and the 5 years in which they ran the Greater London Council and did all sorts of wild and interesting things with it. So I wanted to do this partly to redress this idea that, that London was this kind of city of metropolitan elite, and you had to explain the fact that London was radical, whereas actually, I was writing it from a constituency which has been Labour voting for 90 years, which is true of most of inner London. So it was fairly kind of, I found a lot of the kind of talk about, we have lost our true authentic voters. And now we have these kind of fake ones, these sort of elite ones. And I thought talking about Londoners as an elite was outrageous for various reasons, not least the disaster at Grenfell Tower. So that's kind of what sort of book it was. It was sort of an attempt to sort of do something optimistic and kind of forward-looking by writing about the past. And I think it came very much out of that particular moment, out of that experience of defeat, and then out of writing in lockdown, when the city of London had disappeared and Westminster had disappeared, and you were just left with this London that people lived in. It was no longer a kind of tourist city or a bureaucratic city or a financial city. It was just a place where people lived, and written sort of in the hope that it could permanently become just a place where people live, rather than the place where a very small group of people make phenomenal amounts of money. I think that's my 4 minutes. Thank you.
Stopped almost in mid-sentence there. Thank you for obeying the 4-minute rule anyway. By the way, Marcus Gilroy-Ware is not the Marcus who wrote the book I referred to. Beryl Gilroy is his grandmother, but I was attributing a book to him that he hadn't actually written. It was a different Marcus, which may explain why it wasn't so very prominent on his website when I looked at it, but I looked at it. Or perhaps I was just distracted by his grandmother. Next is not Dan Hicks. The book that his publisher, Verushka Selbach at Pluto, is going to be talking about is the Brutish museums, the Benin bronzes, colonial violence and cultural restitution. Because Dan has actually got his book launched on tonight, I think in Oxford. So he's unable to attend, but very pleased that Verushka, his publisher, has come along in his stead. Verushka, you have 4 minutes or so.
Hi, everyone. I am the MD of Pluto Press, so I can't lay claim to being his publisher. Otherwise, I'm just a representative of his publisher. Dan would really love to be here tonight, but he is launching the paperback of the Brutish Museums at Blackwell's, and he just sent us a photo of the books right in the doorway, which he's really thrilled about. I'm extremely proud to be representing Dan and this incredible book here tonight. We're really honored to be shortlisted, especially alongside 6 amazing books written by you 6 amazing authors. But of course, I'm completely biased in my love of this particular book. In short, the book tackles a particularly contentious issue. It passionately lays out the fact that many of the artifacts and objects that we see in Western museums are looted and stolen. And it finally put forward a really strong case for restitution and reparation. We published this book in November 2020, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and in the wake of a major resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And the impact the book has had on restitution discussions is incredible. But isn't that the whole point of what we do in radical publishing? We amplify important issues, we facilitate discussions, and ultimately learn and change people's minds. When a book does that so quickly, like this one has, it's quite humbling. For me, one story illustrates the impact of the book really well. The book attracted a celebrity superfan, MC Hammer. For those of you too young to remember him, you really need to look him up because he was fabulous and still is. He promoted the book heavily and even bought copies for his Twitter followers who couldn't afford to buy one for themselves. On the 5th of March, MC Hammer held an event on Clubhouse. It's a new social media platform with Dan to discuss reparation. It was held in US time. So the event lasted for 4.5 hours. And so Dan was up most of the night talking about this. It had 475 attendees. And in the morning, we came into 240 orders on our website. At the same time, the book reached 4,000 in the Amazon rankings. It's pretty incredible. Luckily, Dan has sent in a few words about the continued impact of the book. He says, the book launch in Oxford is not the only event scheduled for the same time as this award ceremony. At Jesus College, Cambridge, a ceremony is underway right now to hand back a bronze figure of a cockerel looted in the 1897 attack on Benin City to a party from the Royal Court of Benin. That such an event is happening underlines how much the cause for African cultural restitution has advanced in the 12 months since the Brutish Museums was published. The restitution movement is an African-led movement and one that stretches back decades. So too, as the book argues, is the fallism movement. The Rhodes Must Fall Oxford campaign, led by South African and Zimbabwean colleagues from 2015, provided a crucial spark for writing this book. I am indebted to Rhodes Must Fall campaigners for teaching me how colonial infrastructure, whether statues in our streets or stolen art in our museums, was erected to make colonial violence last. Their continued anti-colonial, anti-racist struggle to remove the monument to Cecil Rhodes from the streets of Oxford deserves our continued attention, support, and solidarity. I want to thank the judges and the Bread and Roses Award and the Alliance of Radical Booksellers for recognizing this book. We're absolutely thrilled and honored to be shortlisted. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Olivette Otele. Her book is African Europeans, an Untold Story, an Untold History, published by Hurst. And there's a clearly direct link almost between Dan's book and the work that Olivette does, and it reflects what Stella was writing about as well. Because Olivette is the Professor of History of Slavery and Memory of Enslavement at the University of Bristol, and is often on broadcast and print media about this particular issue. By the way, to my horror, I picked up a leaflet in our bookshop from a political group today who at their conference have a session called After Black Lives Matter, What Next? And it's as if the demonstrations aren't as big as they were, but to them, Black Lives Matter is so over, that so many relevant books are on this shortlist is an indication that the Black Lives Matter is not over at all. Olivette, you have 4 minutes and you'll be the last of the speakers tonight.
Thank you very much for this. I'm delighted and honored. What has been happening to this book is beyond what I predicted. I wanted to write this book for my children I wanted them to be proud of who they are. I wanted them to not go through what I understand and accept, which they do actually compared to what I did, that, you know, we are the product of several identities. I saw, as they were growing up, starting with lighter skin, as they grew up having, you know, turning into darker skin, people in the different ways they were treated by society, the society they live in, and the means they find to fight against it, or even without comprehending what it meant. So it's the layers of identities that I wanted to explore. So at the time I was urged to write an academic book, and I didn't have my entrance into Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Presses, and I said, I'm going to pause for that one. I just wanted to write something that touches me. So started in 2016, full-time teaching, 2 kids, and, you know, the rest of it, I struggled a bit. And I spoke to somebody, Michael Dwyer, by chance, because he attended a talk I gave. And on one of the few occasions I had a chance to go to London, it's actually expensive to go from Wales to London. But anyway, went there, and he heard me, and he said, yeah, let's do that. And I was very proud, because it's the publisher who published Steve Biko, and I was excited about it. So I wrote the book, and then it just, you know, it got out of hand, because I don't control anything to do with this book anymore. But never mind, that's what children are about. We just let them go and live their lives. I'm going to tell you a bit more about the book. So the book is about the experiences and trajectories of those I named African Europeans. One of them, people of African descent who carved a space for themselves in European settings as scholars, soldiers, enslaved people. Now, when I say carved a space, I mean that even when they were enslaved, many found ways to have agency and to survive in difficult environments. They also find ways to tell their stories and transmit these to new generations. So as an educator, for me, this is a fascinating point, because it is about the production and transmission of knowledge, even in places where that seems impossible. I looked at the question of discrimination based on religion, class, gender, race. I examined the construction of European identities and the hierarchical societies that view the other as inferior. That other was not necessarily based on racial considerations, because my book starts from the 3rd century, it ends in the 21st century. And I relied on characters who have been deemed exceptional, but I also question the notion of exceptionalism and how that engages with discrimination and exclusion. Those exceptionals are wonderful, but it means that they did not represent the bulk of their kinds or their communities. And they don't, and in the eyes of those who put them on the pedestal, those who allow their voices to be heard and amplify their trajectories took on a different turn. It means that they set the bar at levels that allows those racialized as Black to be accepted in given societies only where they were indeed seen as exceptional. Even looking at what it means to be exceptionals, we can see that it allows us to see how being educated, for example, meant you were great. What about those who weren't? What about the silenced voices? What about those Black and brown bodies that were used as commodities, reproductive tools, and currencies? I examined the stories of African Europeans in Rome, Florence, Spain, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Poland, Russia, Denmark, Greece. I also questioned the silencing of Black women's voices and the obsession regarding their bodies in some of the narratives. The lack of archival material about many of them is telling, and the distortion of their experiences, women, I mean, and the reduction of their existence to exoticized bodies, sexualized bodies. And these ideas have legacies in the 20th and 21st century, and I particularly focused on France and the Netherlands to explore that. In that context, the most important part, and what is really at the core of the book for me, is agency, stories of resilience, adaptability, liberation stories, activism. These are the stories that my grandmother told me about her community. These are the stories I wanted to share, but I couldn't because, well, they're not famous stories. So the book ends with such examples and celebrates Black French Afrofeminist activism in the Netherlands, Black Britain, and even more specifically, the many ways in which one can be Black, one can be British, one can be a Black British woman, one can be Black, British, and Welsh. It is a story of hope, a call for action, a plea to end racial, gender, social inequalities and violence. It seems a bit naive, but this is what kept me, I think, alive for 51 years. It is a call to be bolder and work collaboratively for better, fairer, brighter societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivette. Now we pass over to, I think it's Jane Watts from the judges, but it may be Karen.
Yes, it's going to be me.
It's you. Hello, Jane.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm in order to catch up time, I won't talk separately about each book, but I will just sum up our thinking and then hand over to Karen for the announcement. But as you've just heard, I mean, what a set of books and speakers. And I think that absolutely sums up probably where we were trying to go. It's a very broad and very diverse shortlist. How amazing. They're very strong. And I was trying to work out, well, do these books have anything in common? Such a range. But I realized, of course, they do, and in their different ways. And I think, Olivette, you've just summed that up at the end there really well, because yes, they do. All these books do exactly what a radical political book should do. They are, of course, incredibly well researched, all of them, without exception. This was a very, very strong list for that. They're very informative, but what radical books need to do is not leave you where you started, not leave you with the book and nothing else to go to. It's about making change. So that's what these books do, and that's what they've got in common. There's an implicit or explicit call to activism or to action in all of them. There's a need for us to do better. Sometimes that's no more than knowing that you need to know more, that you need to understand more, that you need to carry on being curious. But other times, what comes out of that book is you just have to do something now. You can't just leave it there. So this is challenging reading, and so it should be. And that's what radical political nonfiction books should do. There's some unflinching truth-telling in these books, but all of it inspires us, and all of us encourages us to reflect and to act. And so it's proper radical reading, whichever one. So I'm not going to comment on each book, but I would like to congratulate all of you on the level of research and the passion that you've put into your books. And we enjoyed them hugely as a set of judges reading them. So I'll stop there, if that's okay, Ross, and we can hand over to Karen.
Thank you. As a judge for the first time, the pleasure of working with other people who read these books carefully, thought of them, and all of the books on the shortlist, I think in some way we all feel they are our children. It would be odd if we said the authors felt like our children, but all of these books are ones I think we would feel happy to hold up to people and say, you must read this. And as book lovers, everyone in the audience knows that feeling. But as people who look at books of inspiration for the left and for those who are building a better world and know that we must, these books have added urgency. I could speak for a very long time about any of them. What you would all like to hear now is, out of this short list of incredibly inspiring and excellent books, who the winner is. I will tell you that, and I will leave just a few words about why this book in particular, I think, was so close to our hearts. I'm really, really honored to have the opportunity to say that out of this list, the winner this evening is The War on Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare, and the Making of a Human Catastrophe by Ellen Clifford, published by Zed Books. The one thing I will leave you with is something that Ellen said in the book about DPAC, an courageous organization she is part of, but I think it also describes this book and the movement of disabled people, 22% of the UK population. The one thing that disabled people are familiar with by the very definition of being disabled is struggle. What Ellen says is the aim of Deepak's style of campaigning and the message of defiance it sends is to give all important hope and confidence to people, disabled and non-disabled alike. And for me and for the judges I had the honor of working with, this book, like all those on the shortlist, is an inspiration and a source of hope. Thank you.
Well, we have a winner. Alan, would you like to say something?
I think I'm too stunned to speak. I know we were told we had to prepare something, but I didn't think there was. I didn't think there was a point. I obviously want to thank the Alliance for Radical Booksellers for just existing and for everything you do to promote radical thought. I think that disabled people, more than anyone, tend to understand the importance of radical thought, given that we encounter on a daily basis how the common sense idea of disability is actually at complete odds to the realities of our existence. I have had a lot of messages of support from the disabled community today. We do tend to be quite close. I think that in the collective way that we work, we get to see, we do struggle with life, but we also get to see the best in humanity. We get to see what life is like when you have interdependence and the peer support that I believe all humans need to exist and thrive in life. And people were telling me today they were rooting for me because they felt that this was a book that represents our community and our movement that for so many years hasn't been noticed. There are many barriers to education which disabled people face, which mean that, you know, writing is just not something that people can do. And also reading. Many of my close friends and activists haven't been able to access the book. Luckily, Bloomsbury is doing an audio book that will be out in December. You know, I've attempted to do a BSL version and an easy read summary, which are available on the Deepak website, but just the volume of a book can be too much for some people. So some people value the symbol of the book without actually being able to read it. But the symbol is very important to people. And I think what this means tonight is it feels like, yeah, there's some recognition of our politics, disability politics, and an understanding of disabled people's oppression. And it feels like quite a big moment for our community. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to go down to New Cross and have a pint with some disabled activists now, if anyone's in London. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. We don't have too many pints tonight because we want a nice quote from you that we'll be able to use in the book trade press and the literary press about you winning tonight. So although maybe it would be a more exciting quote if you do have 3 pints. I want to thank the judges, Karen Shook, Jane Elliott, Tom Winter-Rayner, and Jane Watts for the consideration that they give to the books. And I know from the feedback that I got throughout the whole process how seriously they took the process and how much time they spent in it. I want to thank all of the people who submitted books, those who wrote and those who published, and particularly the 7 people who are on the shortlist tonight and their publishers. I also want to end with, from our point of view, with a small note to 2 members of the Alliance of Radical Booksellers, Mandy Ver, who's just retired from News from Nowhere after 45 years. She's been one of the trustees of the Bread and Roses Award since it started. And the Bread and Roses notion was actually taken up at a conference in Liverpool when we got all this thing going. So Will and the Alliance of Radical Booksellers are very grateful to Mandy, who's here tonight as well. And the other person is Nick from Housemans. The reason this event is so late is because of COVID. And Nick, who's the main organizer of the Alliance and the main organizer of the London Radical Book Fair, and has been the main organizer of the Bread and Roses Awards, has had COVID for a long period of time and still suffers from it. And tonight he's standing down after 10 years from from the Bread and Roses Award. So that's 2 out of 3 trustees. I'm the last trustee standing, which means that next year's shortlist will entirely comprise books published by Five Leaves Publications, and the winner will be from Five Leaves Publications. But you know, these things happen. We are talking to other radical bookshops about taking over from us. So that's about it. Thank you to everybody, and particularly to the winner who spoke first. And I think we will all remember the moving comments that she made at the end, where she remembered those who had passed since the book, disability activists who passed since the book was published. That was a very difficult moment to follow, and but it was important. It was very important. Thank you. We'll be back next year. We hope to do the event live, and we hope to revert to having it in May as we had in previous years. But we'll see. One of the big advantages of online is that all of the authors can attend from wherever they are, rather than schlepping down to London. So good. Thank you very much to everybody. If you haven't read all of the shortlist, they're in radical bookshops everywhere and in independent bookshops everywhere. So do read at least some of them. You won't regret it. Good night.